hear about a lawsuit that was filed this morning in St. Clair County. And I can tell you that really this story dates back to 2010 with the implementation of the new Illinois learning standards. And I said to many of my colleagues up here in front of you today that it made no logical sense to institute historically high learning standards in the midst of turning around and prorating funding coming to school districts trying to implement those standards. So what you're here to hear about today is the plight of many of my colleagues that have been up against this 7-year impossible mission. And we have decided as a last resort to take legal action against the state of Illinois in this matter. And my colleagues are going to talk to you about that today. And yes, David Lett, Dr. David Letts, L-E-T-T, Superintendent of Schools, Pana Community Unit School District Number 8. And our first speaker is Superintendent Dan Cox from Staunton, Illinois.
Thank you, Dr. Lett. Good morning. I'm Dan Cox, Superintendent of Staunton Community Unit School District Number 6. That's Dan Cox, C-O-X. On this significant day, I'm proud to stand united with my fellow superintendents who represent an unprecedented number of school districts that have joined together to file a lawsuit against the state of Illinois for failing to adequately fund state-issued mandates regarding the Illinois learning standards. Our purpose is to ensure all children in Illinois receive a high-quality education and to fund school districts adequately and equitably so each and every school can offer all students the high-quality education they deserve. All plaintiffs in this action have local resources per pupil well below the statewide average. This is a result of limited revenues from inequities caused by the over-reliance on local property taxes to fund schools. We are seeking for the state defendants, including the State Board of Education and Governor Rauner, to meet their constitutional obligation for primarily funding public schools. This could be achieved by enacting an appropriate evidence-based method to determine the cost for each district of achieving the Illinois learning standards. Ultimately, if we're successful in court, every school district and every child in public schools throughout Illinois stand to benefit and will no longer be denied the funding they are guaranteed under the state's constitution. The Illinois learning standards, which spell out exactly what students should learn at each grade level, were adopted in 2010. Meanwhile, districts across Illinois have been forced to navigate hundreds of millions in budget cuts. Parents in our communities recognize this. They've watched as we've increased class sizes, as we've laid off teachers, and as we've continually had to do more with less. As superintendents, we have taken many steps to be as efficient as possible, despite state budget cuts and implementing state-mandated learning standards. But this approach is neither sustainable nor fair to our students and families. The state has expected teachers and students to meet newly heightened standards without allocating any additional funding, so our staff then has to navigate changing curriculum without the appropriate resources to do so. This is the opposite of best practice. It's as if we've been using duct tape and superglue to prevent our system from collapsing altogether. Despite being understaffed and ill-equipped, our teachers, administrators, support staff, parents, and communities have all stepped up. These individuals sacrifice year after year to offer students the best possible education despite inadequate funding from the state, and despite unpaid debts the state still owes our districts. To give a sense of how this all adds up, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Art Ryan, Superintendent of Cahokia Schools.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning. And it's Art Ryan, R-Y-A-N, Cahokia Unit School District 187. I'm the superintendent. I would like to take just a few moments to share with you some of the cause and effect issues that the current school funding method created, and try to help you understand why the superintendents who stand here with us today, and along with our boards of education, felt we no longer had a choice but to pursue legal action. Since 2011-12 school year, the state of Illinois has prorated state funding for schools throughout the state. This means that the state has held back a portion of the monies promised to educate children for the last 6 years, most years holding approximately 11% of the funds. This proration has created shortfalls for almost all districts in the state, which districts that depend on the state funding the most, like the ones who stand here today, being hit the hardest. The amount of monies cut from each district varies, but is proportional with the district's annual budget. For Cahokia, we have been shorted $14 million over the past years. The current school year, the state funding was not prorated, but additional funding for things like transportation and extra services for our special needs students, commonly referred to as categorical payments, have not been funded at all. This would mean an additional loss of $4 million to my district and proportionally similar losses for all the other districts in the state. Just like with our family budgets, if our funds are cut, we have only a few options. We can either cut expenses, borrow money, or raise extra income from another source. Most Illinois districts have had to do a combination of all three. Cutting expenses means that we have to cut programs for our children and lay off teachers in our schools. Most districts facing the shortfalls have had to increase class sizes to between 25 to 35 students in a class. How can our teachers and our students be expected to meet high standards which the students will need to reach in order to succeed in today's world? In addition, with less money, programs like music, art, vocational education, after-school extracurricular programs, sports, teacher aides to work with small groups of children, and etc., have all been eliminated. In order to try and keep programs functioning, many districts who could have borrowed money to supplement funding. Imagine paying your mortgage bill, your heating bill, buying your groceries month after month by putting it on your credit card. This system is similar to the current educational funding system, is unsustainable. The only other option is to try and generate extra revenue somewhere else. The only method we have to generate extra revenue is to increase the burden on our homeowners by raising property taxes. In districts like ours with high poverty or middle-class families that are already burdened, that option is destroying our communities. I will speak for myself. In Cahokia, in order to keep our school doors open, we have raised our property tax rate on our citizens to $13.08. This may well be one of the highest tax rates in the entire state of Illinois. I want to point out that these problems were generated by an outdated, inadequate funding method that is currently being used in Illinois. You need only do a basic examination of the offerings to students in affluent communities compared to the opportunities that our students are denied to see the lack of adequacy and equitability throughout the state. Our students, parents, teachers, and community, along with the school boards of our districts, have employed us, the superintendents who stand here today, to do everything in our power to ensure that our students and all students in Illinois receive the opportunity to earn a high-quality education. In Illinois, the quality of a child's education should no longer be based on their address. I would now like to introduce Dr. Jill Griffin, Superintendent of Bethalto Community Unit School District Number 8, to discuss some of the curricular issues our districts face.
Thank you, Art. My last name is Griffin. As Dan already mentioned, in 2010, the state of Illinois adopted the new standards, and districts across the state were required to align themselves, knowing shortly thereafter our students would be expected to demonstrate mastery of our standards on the Park assessment. I was the curriculum director for the Bethalto School District during most of this time. We immediately launched into action, just like the districts represented alongside me here today. Bethalto School District has spent millions of dollars with alignment to the new standards in the last 7 years. Initially, it was English language arts and math standards that we were working towards alignment. In subsequent years, the state has adopted science standards and most recently, new social science standards. The state just continues to pile on with no additional revenue to support these changes. We've purchased new curriculum and resources. We've upgraded and added technology. We've asked our teachers and other experts to help us develop our own curricular units of study. We've built assessments for our students to measure their level of understanding of the new standards. And our teachers in particular, have spent an unimaginable amount of time transitioning our students to the new standards and preparing them for the rigor they can anticipate on the Park assessment. The Park assessment is a mandated assessment required for students in grades 3 through 8, and we took it for the first time in 2015. Initially, it was also given at the high school level, but that changed this year, and now we are giving the SAT in high school. Have you ever heard the analogy of building the plane while you're trying to fly it? That's what many of our educators across the state of Illinois have been doing to align themselves since 2010 with absolutely no additional revenue to support these changes. There was a tremendous amount of pressure initially that every district was going to take the assessment online. However, many districts were not able to purchase the technology necessary to take the Park assessment online. Bethalto took that 2015 deadline for Park, and we mapped out a 5-year plan to ensure alignment, and that we were able to support the new assessment internally because that's what we were told was required. But the state didn't follow through with that initial requirement. So now it varies across the state. Some districts test exclusively online, like Bethalto. Some take it exclusively paper pencil, or in some districts it's a combination of both, paper pencil and online. However, we're all held accountable to the same outcomes, knowing that the level of rigor with each of the testing options varies significantly. Nonetheless, our scores are all laid side by side in the newspapers, not taking into account the type of assessment given, the poverty levels of each of our districts, or the money available to spend per pupil in each district. We are surviving in times of unprecedented accountability, all while we're experiencing unprecedented cuts in our revenue sources, specifically from the state of Illinois. In the Bethalto School District, we cut $2.2 million last week in a public board meeting, simply to balance our books. This is not a decision that our board or I took lightly. We cut 20 positions, and 10 of those were teachers. To date, the state of Illinois owes us over $7 million. This year alone, the state of Illinois has sent no funding to support our special education students. They've sent no funding for regular bus transportation, no funding for special education transportation, and limited funding for early childhood education. We are presently facing a loss of another $1.7 million just this year alone, funding specified for our most vulnerable children. Unfunded mandates by the state of Illinois, like the new standards, should not continue unless the state provides funding for those mandates. So had we not spent millions of dollars working tirelessly to meet the new standards required by the state, with no additional revenue to support that transition, would we be in a position today cutting millions from our budgets? Probably not. But we were told it was required, and we all assumed funding would follow as is stated in the Illinois Constitution. I want to be very clear today. We welcome setting high standards for learning and holding our students accountable to those high expectations. Friends, that is not why any of us are here today on behalf of the children we serve and the districts we represent. Learning standards are not a bad thing. The standards themselves provide us with a roadmap for learning. But even with the most rigorous standards in the history of the state of Illinois, the standards themselves will have little long-term impact for our children if we do not have adequate, equitable distribution of education funding required to help us meet those rigorous standards. On a very simplistic level, how relevant are these standards if I don't have the most basic funding necessary to take students to and from school every day to teach them these standards? It is every district's goal here today to prepare their students for college and career, and the standards are a vehicle in helping us attain that goal. But without adequately funding the standards, we will continue to fall short, which will likely be on the backs of our children, as they ultimately are the ones who suffer most. Let me introduce my colleague, Brad Skirtage, the superintendent of Southwestern School District.
Thank you, Dr. Griffin, and that's S-K-E-R-T-I-C-H. Currently, for every dollar spent on a non-low-income student in Illinois, 81 cents is spent on a low-income student. Article 10, Section 1 of the Illinois Constitution says, "The state shall provide for an efficient system of high-quality education." Mr. Cox, Mr. Ryan, and Dr. Griffin have explained the unprecedented cuts in state funding, both past and present, the impact on local property taxes, class size increases, program cuts, and the cost to implement curriculum improvements, In addition, meeting professional development needs and the high expectations placed on our teachers and administrators during the proration era. Nothing my colleagues have described, nor the actions by the state of Illinois, can be associated with an efficient, high-quality education outlined in the Illinois Constitution, except for the efforts by our teachers and administrators, who, despite unprecedented cuts in state funding, have done their best to ensure students do not suffer because of adult problems in Springfield. The efforts made by our teachers and administrators have been remarkable during this time, but let me be clear, they are not sustainable. Over the past 7 years, the stories being told about larger class sizes, less programs, and minimal supports have continued to grow throughout Illinois. Superintendents, principals, and teachers have clearly explained how the financial crisis in Springfield has negatively impacted children. Despite efforts to properly educate our leaders, pleading for change, and common sense solutions at our legislators' fingertips, when negotiations begin in the Capitol, students' needs get lost in the political shuffle, and the battle for power in Springfield far outweighs doing what is right for children. The stories you have heard today, like so many others, have not raised a sense of urgency and motivated our leaders to reach across the aisle, find common ground, and compromise in the best interest of children. Let me be clear again, litigation was not our first choice. We feel we have exhausted all other possibilities. However, at this time, my colleagues and their respective boards of education do not see any other options to correct the financial crisis that is negatively impacting our students. Therefore, we have joined together to take legal action on behalf of all school districts and students in Illinois. We welcome the high expectations established by the Illinois Learning Standards, but to meet these expectations, school districts require an adequate and equitable funding system, a funding system that will allow educators throughout Illinois to properly meet the individual needs of their students. Educators have fought for their students for 7 years and will continue to fight until change occurs. Unfortunately, that fight now moves to the courtroom, and as we approach a decade, the question still remains: when will the children of Illinois become a priority for our leaders in Springfield? Thank you. We'll be happy to take some questions for a few minutes, if there are any.
So the Illinois Supreme Court has rejected cases like this in the past. They say that they don't want to wade into this, and they can't legally force the General Assembly to spend more money. So what is different about your lawsuit?
I'm going to ask our legal counsel, Mike Pursoon, to answer that question.
Are you talking about the 90s, Michael Pursoon, P-E-R-S-O-O-N, Dupre Schwartz and Gagan Limited? Michael Pursoon, P-E-R-S-O-O-N, law firm Dupre Schwartz and Gagan Limited. I think you're talking about the 1996 case, the Committee for Better Education, or Committee for Educational Rights v. Edgar, where the Supreme Court said, we don't know what a high-quality education is. Well, there's been some real landmark changes since then. So what the court was dealing with there were the state learning goals that had been in place since 1985. What we've seen since then in 97 and 2010, and then in the Implementing Act in 2013 and 2014, is these new, rigorous, high-quality learning standards that have been issued by the Illinois State Board of Education and now define what the state believes a high-quality education is. And what's different with Edgar, Edgar relied on the idea of upholding local control. But when you see the state dictating to all these districts what they've got to do in very precise ways, very detailed learning standards, it amounts to more than 100 unfunded mandates. And the state can't tell them that they've got to do their education a certain way and then hide behind this idea that there's local control, which is becoming more and more of a fiction when you look at these learning standards.
There's an attempt to fix the formula, and education is actually the only part of the budget the governor signed in his first year, and they did a stopgap last year. Schools have stayed open. Is it the distribution of money? Is it more money? Or is it both that you are asking for in this court case?
Well, I think everybody needs more money. Illinois is not paying its bills. It can't even pass a budget. We're in year 2. But what this is looking at is we want the state to have a evidence-based method for determining what it costs the districts to comply with the learning standards and to show substantial, meaningful growth under these learning standards, and then to pay that ticket.
And I know the Constitution says predominant
We're not looking for any specific number, and we're not going to ask a court to give a specific number. But we think that if the state is going to tell these districts what they have to do, the state has to pay for that. And it has to come up with some evidence-based methodology that calculates what it costs to meet the state learning standards.
Why focus the lawsuit on the governor's office and NC and not also bring the legislature into this, since presumably they are part of the, governing process and for getting school funding?
Well, this is how it goes in lawsuits. You sue the governor because he's the executive of the state. So when the Committee for Educational Rights sued back in the 90s, they sued Edgar. They didn't sue, the speaker. And when you're looking at ISB, ISB is the body that actually was empowered by the legislature to make these learning standards, and they implemented and enforced learning standards.
I filed this in the 20th Circuit in St. Clair County as opposed to some other district.
That's where we have a lot of the districts.
Was there any thought to, like, the strategy of that, like that area maybe being amenable to plaintiffs? Did that go into that consideration at all?
We just looked for where it was right to file it, and we have a lot of plaintiffs there, and that's where it was right to file it.
Will the Chicago schools benefit from this lawsuit? Any Chicago schools, would they benefit from the lawsuit?
They're not a party to it. They have their own lawsuit that they're pursuing.
Would this have any effect on them or bearing on them?
It would, I'd really have to speculate on on what the ultimate outcome of the case would be, what it would look like.
And it's 17 districts, is that right?
Yes.
And are you all, has there been a analysis of the proposals for change in formula? Would a change in formula help? Or are you seeking something here that the legislature can't even do with a change in formula?
This is something different. I think everybody wants to see a change in formula that's fair and really does what's right for the kids of Illinois and in these districts. But what this lawsuit looks at is making sure that the state doesn't get to take away local control through learning standards, but then leave these districts writing the check to pay for it.
Okay, and you said you don't have a number, but is there any idea how much, twice as much as you're getting now? Is there any idea what you need? I mean,
This,
what ballpark are we in?
that's up to the state. They've got to make that determination. That's their right. And we would not ask the court to tell them a specific number, and we're not coming in with a specific number.
Do the school districts support the legislation proposed by Senator Menard and Representative Davis?
I think you'd have to ask them each individually. This is talking about the lawsuit that we're looking to get out of these unfunded state learning standards. Or not get out of them, but to make sure that the state does what's right by us and pays its fair share.
There's so much talk about unfunded mandates. Would any of the districts be amenable for a temporary solution to get out of those unfunded mandates, or would you rather just have a blanket legal?
Well, I think as Dr. Griffin said, nobody wants out of these standards. These standards are a good thing for the students, and it's good to hold every student up to a high standard that will make them college and career ready. But the state can't put all that burden to pay for it on us.
So the administration's going to say that that this is historically high level of funding right now, and that the categoricals are in invoices sitting in the comptroller's office, and that you should be suing the comptroller.
Well, I don't know if that gets to an appropriation issue, but when you're talking about the level of funding, we were talking out in the hallway before we started, and to a person, everyone has seen at the same time that standards are going up and costs are going up, state support is going down. So that gap is just widening, whatever the absolute numbers are.
Maybe you answered this already, but are you looking for any, these standards, they're not imposed by the legislature, right? Is it just the state board, and you want them to be taken away?
I think that's just what we were talking about. So if you look at the legislative history, I think it was April 9th of 2014 maybe, there was a substantial amount of debate on this. And that bill ultimately passed, which directed the ISB to promulgate these standards, and it did so. And it's interesting, if you look at the debate that day, Senator Staines, who was I think one of the sponsors of the bill, said, if we don't resource this, it's hard to expect our schools to keep moving forward in all the advancements we've been asking them to do. And the state is not resourcing this.
Cahokia,
Yes.
can you put your website or
My kindergarten classes, all of them are somewhere between 28 and 30. And actually, yeah, but a single teacher, yes. As a matter of fact, those numbers are pretty much universal K through 12 in my entire district. Virtually every grade level is somewhere in that range.
If the lawsuit is not successful, what will you have to cut next? In other words, what happens?
I will be very honest with you. Over the last 6 or 7 years, as I said, with the money, we have cut over 80 teaching positions. We are as bare bones as we can absolutely get. As a matter of fact, a lot of the superintendents standing here with me today have had to riff or lay off people this year. We laid off no one because we have no one left to lay off. You know, again, I have enough teachers to put 30 kids in every classroom, and that's all I have. If the funding mechanism does not change, if there's not some process to bring more money into our schools, in all honesty, I will likely have to close the doors. We will not be able to pay our bills. And then we'll have to see how the state wants to deal with that issue.
Are you deficit spending?
We're not deficit spending at this point. We end the year with a few dollars, left over, but it's very minimal. We are basically spending what we're bringing in. Now, again, that was at the start of this year. We had a balanced budget, but that was before $4 million of proration wasn't, of the mandates. Right.
And they say.
But we count on that money. I mean,
I know, they say you're gonna get it.
well, again, they say we're going to get them. I will tell you this. We received the last payments from the last school year, January of this current year. At a $4 million cut in my current budget, if we do not receive money till January or February of next school year, where's that $4 million supposed to be coming from? I still have to exist. I still have to pay the bills every month.
I don't know how long the MCATs have been prorated versus GSA being prorated. Were those prorated, or was GSA?
Transportation's been prorated for a number of years.
Transportation was prorated previous to GSA.
Right.
And pretty significantly, like,
It basically was in the 80% range, and it's now down to
Yeah.
about 73, I think.
70, I believe, 76, somewhere in that range.
So it's been
Yeah.
Coming down too.
And again, not only prorated, but the payments are being delayed 6, 8, 9 months sometimes. So again,
That's due to the budget impacts, the delays.
I would assume.
Yeah, we would assume.
Did any of you have a property tax measure or a schools consolidation measure on it being municipal elections?
St. Clair County, well, actually St. Clair County and Madison County with Dr. Griffin is in. We both had the 1 cent sales tax on the ballot. Both of them were defeated. Yes, they were defeated. I do believe we have. Yeah.
I'm Dr. Greg Furstenau, F-U-E-R-S-T-E-N-A-U. We just passed a referendum last night. We began this process roughly 2 years ago with a group of citizens that worked with Senator Menard on school funding reform and basically traveled the state of Illinois trying to get the right thing done for the children in our school district. Taylorville got to a point where we're at a crossroads and we had to make a decision on what type of an education do we want to provide our children that live within our educational community. When I came to Taylorville 11 years ago, the state of Illinois, our general state aid was roughly about 54%. Today it's 46%, and we're about equal share with our local revenue at 46%, the state at 46%, and the federal government at 8%. So you can see we've suffered proration of general state aid over the past years to the tune of $3.8 million. That was taken out of a budget of right around $24 million. This year, under the mandated categoricals, we have not received a payment, as my colleagues have said. That's $1.6 million to the Taylorville School District. So when you look at this, there had to be a decision made in terms of how do we provide the best education for our children. Fortunately, we had a dedicated committee of Citizens for Education that worked extremely hard over the past 2 years, and were able to sell our community last night in winning a .85 per 100 That is a very high tax increase for a community to absorb in these particular times of no Illinois state budget, not knowing what's going to happen in Springfield. They unanimously supported this 70% or a little over 69% to 30%. So call it 70-30%. It was a fairly good-sized voter turnout of roughly 6,500 voters. We had well over 4,000 voters that did this. So our local community, much like a lot of my colleagues up here, has had to step up to be able to meet the necessary resources to provide a quality education. We did propose $2.2 million worth of cuts over 2 years. We basically told our community there will be no art, there will be no music, there will be no foreign language, there will be no athletics, there will be no vocational ag, there will be no programs. You need to make a decision on what you want within your community. We were fortunate last night. I haven't seen many of the election results around the area, but Taylorville was fortunate last night that our community did step up. But after that, our partner, the state of Illinois, needs to get its act cleaned up, because that's what's going to start to happen. If you have the ability and your citizens are willing to do that, people are going to be forced to raise property taxes. Unlike our partners at the state want property tax freezes. You can't have it both ways. You must fund schools in a fair and equitable way.
Superintendent Bryant,
Yes.
how many years have you been above $10?
Well, I've been superintendent for the last 5 years, and it was, for most of that, our rate was $11. So I'd have to get back on, exactly how long it's been, but it's been quite a while. And again, we went from 11.08 last year to the 13.08 this year, just simply because we were actually undertaxing in tort and a few of our other funds. Unfortunately, my district, with the poverty level we have, that $13.08 tax rate only generates about $9 million. So again, obviously, as we said earlier, the poorer the communities, the more poverty you have, the more impact you have to hit them with just to generate enough money to try and get by.
How close were the 1 cent tax?
For St. Clair County, it really wasn't close. It was defeated by about 5,000 votes. But in Madison County, I believe it was, 250, 300 votes, about
Last night
300.
it was under 300, but then I heard this morning it was closer to 700, but it was
Okay.
several hundred.
Anybody else? Thank you, everybody.